Welcome everyone to this International Papillomavirus Society webinar. Before we start, we want to inform people to get ready for the HPV awareness campaign of 2021 on the 4th of March 2021 about HPV, a virus we all can beat. Also, we want to inform you about the online platform for HPV advocacy and awareness, where you can use online collaboration, connect and collaborate, advocacy and public information, and events and consultation. Also, we want you to take note of the 34th International Papillomavirus Conference that will be held from Toronto or in Toronto on November 15, 19, 2021. And just to tell you that we're going to be introducing a monthly webinar series in 2021. And if you're not registered already to receive information, you can log on ipvc2020.org. So this morning is a post-conference webinar series that is about the elimination of cervical cancer, now, later, or never. And the speaker is Professor Joachim Dillner, who has an interest in research for many, many years and predicted many of the things that are coming live before our own eyes. So this morning, it will be about the elimination of cervical cancer, what's happening in Sweden, and the title of the presentation is about elimination of cervical cancer, now, later, or never. I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Joachim Dillner, who is an infectious disease epidemiologist at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm. Joachim, you can take over, please.
Okay, thank you very much. As Mark said, I'm Joachim Dillner, and I will be talking about elimination of cervical cancer. Do we want it now, or do we want it later, or do we want it never? And I will try to explain why this is actually an active decision and depends a lot on the countries on what you want to do. Here is my conflict of interest slide. I don't have any current conflicts of interest related to HPV vaccination. Now, the global elimination of HPV, the first papers about this were already published in the 1990s. And it's interesting to compare with the case of eradication of the polio virus, because all the theoretical aspects are actually better for HPV than they were for polio. We don't have any animal hosts, and the thing with latency and how many people actually are diseased by the virus, it's actually better for HPV than what it was for polio. So the declaration that we should really try to have a global elimination of HPV, it was made by the WHO the first time in 2016, and it was widely publicized in 2018. And I think that the declaration of Australia that we would have an aim to eliminate cervical cancer by 2028 was widely known all over the world. Australia had a special case. They were very fast to vaccinate all the women. They had a gender-neutral vaccination, and we also switched to HPV screening at one and the same date for the whole country, so it was highly effective. So the major strategies for cervical cancer elimination, I call it, the first one is catch-up vaccination. That would be the fast way to really ensure that HPV infection stops circulating in the population as soon as possible. I'll be explaining exactly what the demands are to entirely stop the circulation of HPV. But if you then think that we have arrived at the stage where HPV circulation has entirely stopped, the next thing is to reach all the women who have been infected already before the circulation of HPV was stopped, and ensure that they have cervical screening with a sensitive and specific screening test, which would be HPV screening. Interestingly, when you have stopped the circulation of HPV, you would need to reach these women only once it has been stopped. And if you have stopped the HPV circulation and you have reached all the infected women with a prevalent infection, if you have accomplished that, you have accomplished a permanent elimination of cervical cancer. The next thing I wanted to dwell on is whether screening has a time component. This is very commonly thought of, that screening has a time component, that it would take a very long time before we see any results. And as an example, I show here, this is the cervical screening incidence in Sweden, where we started with cervical cancer screening in the 1960s. And then the cervical cancer incidence was slowly coming down and was at its lowest in 2013, when it was down to less than half of the incidence that it was in the 1960s. So you would think that probably there is some sort of incubation time here of about 40 years before you see the full effect. But that is actually misleading. If you think about a case where you would manage to screen and treat an entire population on one day, say that you do it on Monday, then the full effect would be seen on Tuesday. So actually, the reason why it took 40 years before you saw the full effect is that this is how long time it took to build the infrastructure and get everything working. But now, when it is clear that we have a global elimination goal, it should really go faster than that. So the second thing that I wanted to dwell on is why we're doing repeat screening at regular intervals. Well, the first reason for this is that the screening test that we used originally had a low sensitivity. The sensitivity of a pap smear is estimated at only about 70%. And then what was missed in one screening would then be detected in the next screening round. But this is actually not relevant if you are doing the screening using the HPV testing that is very sensitive. So the other thing is that the risk factors are circulating, so that even if you're negative for HPV in one screening round, maybe you would be infected soon after that, and the carcinogenic process would start again, and you would need new screening because of this. But however, if you have stopped the circulation of HPV, this is also not valid any longer. So if we have HPV control and we have a good screening test such as HPV screening, screening is actually needed only once. It's a one-time campaign that we need to do in an effective way. Now I will show you some slides regarding the age distribution of incidence and prevalence of HPV, which is amazingly consistent in a lot of countries. This is one of the oldest, it's work done almost 20 years ago by Kate French on Finnish data. Here is actual data on prevalence down here, and here is data on incidence as modeled from the prevalence data. And you can see how sharp it is, that it's very common to have HPV infection in the ages from 16 to about 24, but very little among the older women. This is more recent modeling data from Simo-Pekka Venska in Finland and done last year. And here is the HPV incidence for women and men. And again, he's estimating at around age 20, we have this huge peak of a lot of HPV. And the older the women and men get, the more rare it is to have an incident HPV infection. This is the incident of HPV-16 in Sweden before vaccination, work done together with Jacopo Bausano at the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And again, we see that before vaccination, we had this huge peak of a lot of incidents of HPV-16 among women who were about 18 years of age, which then declines. And above age 35, we have almost no new infections of HPV. When that is translated to a reproductive rate of HPV infection, a reproductive rate of HPV infection, we make the argument that we think of a population as consisting of only people who are 35 years old and older. If that were the case, the reproductive rate of HPV-16 would be 0.4, which means that it would disappear quite rapidly. If we have the experiment that the population consists only of people 30 years and older, the reproductive rate is 1.1, which means that it's just barely managing to still exist in the population. So we have the school-based vaccination, which has 82% coverage. These women are already 20 years old. And then we have the organized catch-up vaccination, where women are invited by letter to go to a vaccination station for vaccination. It has a 62% coverage, and those women are already 27 years of age. So we are already into the screening program and have much less HPV infections. This slide is a modeling of the demands for HPV eradication. And actually, here I deliberately say the word eradication. Elimination is elimination of cervical cancer as a global public health problem, whereas eradication means that the aim is actually to put it at zero. And the aim here is actually to have the infection decline to absolutely zero. Over here, you have first the continued propagation of HPV based on how many of the population that are immune. Now, if you look here on the dark blue one, which is HPV-16, is the one that has the highest reproductive rate and is the most difficult to eradicate. You can see that you will have a complete eradication of HPV-16 in a girls-only vaccination program when it is approaching about 90% coverage. It's easier to have eradication for 18 and for the intermediate risk types, such as 31 and 33. And over here with HPV-6, we can see that it's actually quite easy to eradicate HPV-6, which means that HPV-6 and condylomas as a marker of the success of HPV vaccination programs is actually a little bit misleading, because it's much easier to control HPV-6 than to control HPV-16. To the right is the predicted result if you vaccinate both sexes. And interestingly, you will see eradication of HPV-16 already at 70% population coverage, which doesn't appear to be unreasonable. Now, which HPV types do we really need to control? This is a recently published paper where we looked on the screening history for all cervical cancers in Sweden for the past 10 years and requested the paraffin blocks and typed them. So what's interesting here is that there is a strong difference depending on whether a cancer was screen detected or symptom detected, or whether it was detected in the screening program ages or in the ages when screening has already stopped. And we can see that it's basically only for 16 and 18 but it's a higher proportion inside the screening program than outside the screening program. For all other types, it's mostly more common outside the screening program and in the age groups where we no longer screen, such that in the screening ages, it's greatly dominated by HPV 16 and 18. And if we manage to have a control of those, and if we manage to screen the women who may have been infected by 16 and 18 before control, we will basically have managed to greatly reduce the cervical cancer incidence and approach elimination. So, in summary, I think that you can achieve eradication of HPV 16 with a one-sex vaccination program, but you would need a coverage of 90% or better. If you vaccinate with both sexes and have a population coverage of 70%, which is reasonable for a lot of countries, then the eradication is predicted even of 16, which is the most difficult type to eradicate. Gender-neutral vaccination strategy is a common strategy in a lot of countries, and many countries do vaccinate up to age 26, such that if you have gender-neutral vaccination up to age 26, it's just a few years of people getting older until you achieve a complete control of these viruses. So it's imminent and close in time. This is the first paper on eradication of HPV 16. It's almost 20 years old, but again, this was Jeff Garnett who did this. He estimated that if you vaccinate girls only, you need 90% to achieve an eradication. And whereas if you vaccinate both sexes, he also arrived at 70% of coverage to achieve an eradication. Interestingly, it's now 5 years ago that the first report of eradication of HPV 16 was published. Here is this paper from Australia, where they stated that they had a sentinel system looking at only the women who are positive for chlamydia infection, a high-risk group, where before vaccination, a very large proportion of these women, 16%, were positive for HPV 6. But the last woman who had HPV 6 in a chlamydia positive sample was found in 2009, and they hadn't seen it since then. It agrees well with our modeling result, and also there are several papers describing a drastic decline also of the oncogenic 16 and 18 from, for example, from Australia and Scotland, that are well in line with the modeling that I just showed you. The other thing is that also the real-life data on the effect of cervical cancer in regard to HPV vaccination is very much in line with an effect also on invasive cancer should be possible to see soon. This is data from Sweden, where we have a compulsory vaccination register, and which resulted in that we could determine exactly that it was 527,000 women who had had the vaccine and 1,114,000 women who did not have the vaccine. And then we could follow them with the registries to see how many of them had had invasive cervical cancer. Well, it was only 19 women among the vaccinated women, but 538 women among the non-vaccinated women. This translates to a relative risk of 0.12 for the young women, and for the women who had been vaccinated at young age, that is, and for the women who had been vaccinated between 17 and 30, still a significant risk reduction of 0.47. This is well in line with the previously published data from clinical trials They had much smaller numbers, but it's worth noting that they actually reported a statistically significant reduction in invasive cervical cancer. And the other thing that I should point out is the data on the age relation of 16 and 18 to invasive cervical cancer, where it is quite clear that 16 and 18 are rather highly oncogenic types with cancers that are appearing in young ages, such that when we look at the youngest women, there is more of them that are 16 and 18 than compared to when we look in all ages, which is probably explaining why we have so high protection, 88%, when it's actually for cancers in all ages, it's actually 70% that are 16 and 18, but in the young ages, 16 and 18 are quite dominating. So the other thing that I wanted to say is about screening among highly vaccinated birth cohorts. It's in general not a good idea. And I took the example from Sweden here, where I mentioned that we already have highly vaccinated women in the organized catch-up program in the ages 23 to 26. And when we screen them, it's very interesting that they still have a lot of CIN lesions, but they no longer contain 16 and 18, the most carcinogenic types. They contain some other type that's not very oncogenic. For example, we had only 4 lesions out of 121 that contained 16 or 18. And among the control women, 16 and 18 in positivity was quite rare. The most common type in the CIN lesions was HPV 51. And as I mentioned before, we had systematically typed all the cancers in the screening program for 10 years. And there was not a single case of cancer caused by HPV 51. So it seems to us that screening in highly vaccinated birth cohorts is mostly overdiagnosis. A few words regarding vaccination and population coverage. This is the latest data I could find from the WHO. It's from 2017. In that case, there were vaccination programs reporting statistics from 82 countries, very large amount of doses given. The average of population coverage was 61%, but it varied from 8% all up to 98% coverage. But an interesting finding was that I was not really able to find much correlation to whether the countries were high income or low income countries. Here are the countries in the top who have vaccination coverages above 90%, that's what they are reporting to the WHO. And interestingly, only one of them is in Europe. So it seems that it's not really the income status of a country, but some aspect of organization that is the major determinant of the coverage. And actually, we have a natural experience on this from Sweden because we first offered a program that was recommended by government and subsidized with funds from government, but the women would need to seek where to themselves would need to seek where they can get it. This is called on-demand vaccination or non-organized vaccination. This is this line here. It achieved at maximum 30% coverage. Then we have this dashed line here, which is called organized catch-up vaccination. The women are invited by letter with an appointment at the screening station. And at this screening station, they would need to find where it is and find a way how to go there. So it is a little bit not so convenient for them to find where is this screening station. But 62% of the women show up when they have been invited. And then this is the school-based vaccination up here, above 80%, a very convenient way to be vaccinated in a place that you have to go to anyhow. So that's the same population, shows very different results depending on how you organize it. Now, the second thing that I wanted to dwell on is whether we could use innovative concepts for vaccination and screening to speed up the control of HPV infection, as well as to have a more targeted and less unspecific vaccination program. This is called the FASTER concept. And the FASTER concept means that you would invite all women to a joint vaccination and screening occasion. At this occasion, you would both offer vaccination and an HPV screening. Some 90% of the women will not have HPV, and as they are vaccinated, the risk will be so low, so we don't need to come back again. But the women who are vaccinated, they would, who are vaccinated and already HPV positive, they are a risky group for having CIN and so on. So the screening program can focus on following these up and giving them adequate treatment. So that brings me to the next issue, and that is the one-size-fits-all screening, which is something that almost all countries are doing. We are recommending the same screening intervals, the same start and stop ages for everyone, the same general flow chart for everyone. And one wonders, why are we doing this? It's very easy to identify risk women with hugely increased cervical cancer risks can be identified based on screening history that almost every country is recording. Here are some examples that we found in the Swedish cervical screening registry. The by far highest risk were the women who had had glandular atypia, and then also if they've had some other abnormality where no biopsy had been taken afterwards, very high risks. And then it's of course the long-term non-attenders who don't take a screening. They are also at quite high risk. On the other hand, participants with multiple normal smears have extremely low risk, about 1 per 100,000. So they are already well below the HPV border for elimination of cervical cancer. So if we are aiming to go below 4 per 100,000 person years in incidence of cervical cancer, then actually a large majority of the population is already well below this border. And the task would be to reach the women that have risks that are above the WHO cervical cancer elimination threshold. So how do we do that? Well, first we need to identify them. If you have recorded the screening history of the women, this is actually a rather easy task to see which ones are these women. And then you would offer them HPV screening in a one-time campaign. As an example, in our country we have 3 million women that are currently targeted by an organized screening program. But it's only 230,000 women have risks above 20 per 100,000 woman years. They generate a majority of the cases. And in the example where if these women could be reached and offered adequate screening, we would arrive at an overall risk for cervical cancer in Sweden of less than 4 per 100,000. So we started a pilot project on this with SMS-based invitations. In this one, we selected about 1,000 women who are the ones who had the highest cervical cancer risk that we could see based on their screening history. And we sent them an SMS and offered them a link where they could offer a self-sampling kit for HPV. So when then if they were positive, there was a specialist gynecologist in each region where the woman is actually living. And we are doing this currently only for a pilot project. First phase was 1,000 women, next phase is 6,000 women. And if this continues to work well, we would ultimately be doing this for 230,000 women at the time point when HPV circulation has been stopped, which I project to have happened between 3 to 5 years from now. So the strategy that we are suggesting to achieve a faster eradication of cervical cancer is to, on top of what's doing routinely, have a one-time campaign that invites all the women in the early ages of a screening program. Here it's suggested to do it for the first 3 ages, to do both vaccination and HPV screening. And the women who have participated here who are negative don't need follow-up. Only HPV positive women need a follow-up. And then the other one is to invite all the high-risk women to HPV-based screening in all age groups. So to summarize this, what I've been trying to convey is that I think that we should be aware of that we have a choice. It's when do we want to eliminate the oncogenic HPV types and eliminate cervical cancer? We could either say that we want this to happen now. If we want it to happen now, we could do an ambitious catch-up vaccination to ensure that we have immunity covering all the age groups that are still propagating the HPV infection, and then follow that with a one-time screening campaign to reach the women who may have been infected before HPV circulation was stopped. That is would be an effect in a very short time. I would say now is approximately 5 years or something, but that's really like tomorrow. Or we could say that, well, we want this cervical cancer elimination, but later. So if you were to do like a well-organized vaccination program in schools, for example, and have the standard type of routine ongoing screening that most countries already have, then you would have a cervical cancer elimination. But it would take 50 years or more before all the vaccinated girls who have been vaccinated in schools have been sufficiently old such that they don't have any more cervical cancer that they could have. Or we can say that we are not interested in cervical cancer elimination and this will never happen. And actually this is rather easy. If you for example, have a very ineffective vaccination program that reaches only 10% of the population or something, then you will never have cervical cancer elimination. Any strategy that allows a continued circulation of oncogenic HPV in the population will probably be the alternative, never. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. I hope that most of you will decide that you want cervical cancer now, or at least within our lifetime. And here are some links where you can read more about us and what we are doing to promote the cervical cancer elimination. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Willner, for your excellent presentation. And I see by the number of questions that you're interested and tickled a lot of our listener. So First question, the waning of immunity following vaccination is still unclear. What will be the impact on the eradication if the vaccine protection is not long-term?
Yeah, I think that first, there is rather long-term studies published. I think that the longest one we have done had 12 years of follow-up after vaccination and was still showing adequate antibody levels against the HPV types after 12 years. It's also the fact that because the incidence is so much, very much effective in the young ages, such that if you vaccinate girls when they are 12, and we know that the immunity will be there for another 12 years, you have basically covered the whole time when they are active in spreading the infection, such that as we are looking at this from a population level and we want to stop the spread of the infection in the population, I think that the current data with an immunity long-term persistence of 12 years will be enough to stop the spread of the infection.
There's a question. The data you presented is mostly the effect of the 4-valent vaccine. How impactful is the new 9-valent vaccine likely to be for cervical cancer elimination in comparison with the current 4-valent vaccine?
Yeah, this is, I didn't say this explicitly, but this is one of the reasons why I showed the type distribution of HPV types in cervical cancers inside our screening program, where it is evident that 16 and 18 are very much dominating both among younger women and among women in the screening program, such that it's dominating to the extent that I think that you would be able to achieve an elimination below 4 per 100,000 even with the first generation vaccine. It will of course be even better with the 9-valent vaccine, and I would in particular like to point out that the faster concept, when you do joint vaccination for HPV and HPV screening, and the women who are negative and vaccinated have so low risk that you don't need to follow them, that basically has use of a non-valent vaccine as a prerequisite. Otherwise, there will still be some risk left and you cannot let these women go.
Why does FASTER suggest vaccination between 23 and 27 years when your data shows significant improvement and protection through vaccination before 17 years, and programs such as in the UK vaccinate school children 12, 13 years?
Yeah, so I'm sorry if I was unclear on this point. I'm of course, I am assuming that the countries have already instituted an appropriate and well-organized vaccination program targeting the youths in the younger ages where before they have their first exposure to HPV infection. But what I'm suggesting here on a faster campaign to achieve the cervical cancer elimination faster, this is on top of a well-organized HPV vaccination program targeting the youngsters in the school.
Are you statistic overly optimistic? We don't know yet if non-vaccine HPV types that are low risk may become oncogenic, or new oncogenic might be discovered.
Yeah. There are, of course, many hypothetical things that can happen. There is one that we have been particularly interested in was the issue of so-called type replacement, that if we eradicate HPV 16 and 18, will something else pop up that is also oncogenic? And we did a lot of work to study if this happens. And well, I think the basic conclusion is that it is not very fast, and if it happens, it's slow. And also the 16 and 18 are so much more oncogenic than all the other types, such that if it were to happen that something else becomes more common after eradication of 16 and 18, it would still contribute very much to a lowered incidence of cervical cancer.
Is 2-dose vaccination welcome then?
Is 2-dose vaccination what?
Welcome? Because now for adults, we're going to 3 doses. Many countries recommend for adolescent 3 dose. Not all countries have moved to 2 dose.
Yeah, I think that it's actually for us in the scientific community, the question is much more on whether we can move to 1 dose. I know that WHO has for many years been suggesting 2 dose, and 2 dose is what we are using in a lot of countries, for example in Sweden. But in the research setting, there is very interesting data from several countries on adequate protection even by 1 dose. I don't know if it's really time to recommend something like that, but I think that uncertainty regarding 2 dose is unlikely to become more, and that for the future it's more that I'm expecting a discussion on whether we need to have 2 dose or whether 1 dose is sufficient.
With the shortage seen with HPV vaccine, do you think that program in LMIC should focus on female vaccination or be gender neutral vaccination to achieve best outcomes?
No, this is a more political question. You know, I'm not a vaccine producer, I'm a scientist. I'm estimating what will happen if you do this or do that. And of course, if you don't have vaccines, you can't do this. But I'm only stating that as far as we can see, the fastest way to eradicate these HPVs would need a rather ambitious vaccination, ambitious and well-organized vaccination strategy.
How probable do you think it is for a country with opportunistic screening and with a non-school-based vaccination program targeting at girls 11 to 18 to achieve elimination?
I think that sounds to me like the never elimination alternative. If you have the basic vaccination of the 11 to 18-year-olds is on demand, I'm wondering if that will achieve sufficiently high population coverage. I haven't really seen that. I would be, as I mentioned, an approximately 70% coverage of both sexes or 90% of one sex will be necessary. And I'm wondering if that will be achieved. It sounds like to me like the never elimination option.
From what you've discussed, you would be advocating for HPV testing rather than cytology to attain elimination objective for all countries?
Yes, definitely so. I think that it's the advantages of HPV screening are many. both on its increased sensitivity and also I think because it's not so complex, it's actually well suited for a number of countries who are not the high-income countries, because the actual testing itself is simple, and I think that it's actually well suited to be done in a lot of countries in the world.
This is maybe a tricky one. Which HPV testing should be used for screening of women of all ages in different countries? And if you don't want to answer specifically, what would be characteristic of an HPV test that should be used?
Yes, this is a difficult question, but I can say this, that if you remember the slide I showed on which HPV tests are the most important ones to be found in the screening program, then it's amazing how dominant it is with HPV 16 and 18. So such that I think that an HPV test that cannot give you specific data on 16 and 18 at least should not be used. I think that the HPV tests that provide an extended genotyping for the types that have intermediate risk, like 31, 33, and 45, would be an advantage. But it depends, of course, very much on what is the price and what would the cost be to do this, and is it realistic and in what settings. But at least 16 and 18 I can say, otherwise I don't think it's a good idea.
You've introduced a very good image. You talk about the screening and the Monday and the Tuesday and the 40 years. Can you re-explain? This is kind of new, and some people are trying to understand, because I think it's very heavy argument.
Yeah. I've noticed that it's implicit for a lot of people who are discussing screening. They are expecting that the results will come only after several decades. And the reason why they expect that is because a lot of countries that introduced this, like in the 60s or so on, saw the optimum effect only several decades later. But they started only with one birth cohort, reaching the whole population only a number of years later. They were testing one birth cohort at a time, and then gradually improving the ways we were doing the tests in sensitivity, etc., improving the ways that they summoned the women to the screening stations and so on. And all this optimization took a lot of time. And I think that this intellectual argument, it's interesting for people to think about. Think if you had managed to have all the infrastructure and logistics working such that you could invite the entire population on Monday, test them and treat them on Monday afternoon, then the job would be done on Tuesday. It's actually, of course, not possible to invite the whole population on one day, but I think it's important that the whole scientific community understands that it's not given that a screening program must be slower and not deliver results in decades. The demands should be higher, that it should be implemented faster and achieve results faster.
You propose once in a lifetime screening. Is it likely to be too little? And don't you think that this will generate false expectation that this is sufficient?
Yeah, I think that if HPV is still circulating in your country, I think it will definitely not be safe and sufficient. I'm trying to paint a vision that But what do we do when we have managed to control the HPV infection? After we don't have a risk of new infections of HPV anymore, at that time it's actually once in a lifetime screen after that. But if your vaccination program was no good and that you had a lot of HPV still circulating, you need to have a regular screening still ongoing.
The fact of detecting more HPV-16 in a screening program than outside the program, can this be related to the assay used in the program with higher sensitivity to HPV-16?
That's not the case. The data I showed you on HPV typing of cancers during 10 years, all of this was done before we had switched to HPV-based screening. At that time, we were only doing cytology-based screening in the country, so it had nothing to do with that.
Young population is sexually active in Western countries. Will vaccination till the age of 26 help? Maybe it should be done earlier.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I wasn't sufficiently clear on this, that the catch-up vaccination of a little bit older women, this is important to achieve a faster eradication of HPV, but the basic vaccination of the youngsters at schools, for example, and the ones that are up to 18 and so on, which are the ages where the HPV is most active at being transmitted in an unvaccinated population. That is the most important. But there are so many countries who have achieved good vaccination coverage up to ages 20 already, such that to me it starts to be more thinking about what is the next step. But I understand that in a lot of countries, this first step of high coverage vaccination of all the girls up to age about 18, 20, they have not achieved it yet, but that is definitely the first step before you can think of doing more faster elimination work.
What is your opinion on HPV vaccination of individuals who are HPV positive or as high-grade disease caused by HPV?
Yes, the first one is the concept HPV faster that I described, that you invite women to do at the same time HPV screening and HPV vaccination. And there I'm suggesting that you should vaccinate everyone, including those who are HPV positive. You don't need to test them first, because the ones who are HPV positive, they would anyhow be positive for only one or maximum 2 or 3 types, but they would still be protected against all the other types. And in the follow-up of these women for the future, the ones who are HPV positive already before vaccination, it will be much simpler if we are immune to other types that they could be acquiring during follow-up otherwise. So I think that in a faster concept, if there are countries who are contemplating doing concomitant HPV vaccination and HPV screening, you should definitely vaccinate everyone regardless of their HPV result. It's shown that it is safe to vaccinate the women who are HPV positive, and it will make the follow-up so much easier. The other question is if you have, for example, treated somebody with a high SIL, whether you should do a post-conization vaccination. And there is a large international randomized trial of this coordinated from the United Kingdom, where Sweden and Finland is also participating. And I've also seen that the accumulated evidence of this seems to indicate that it does have some benefit to do this vaccination. It's not really for sure, the data is not entirely in, but I think it will most likely end up in that it's useful.
One last question. What do you think about universal screen and treat for women who have high-risk HPV without further evaluation?
Yeah, this is to a large extent depending on the prevalence. If you have a population where like 20% are positive for high-risk HPV, you can't screen and treat all those women without a lot of harms done by the screening program. So in that setting, I would not advocate it, but I can think of settings, for example, in a population that has already been highly vaccinated and that you have only a few women who still have 16 and 18 and maybe they have already had it for 10 years because they have been vaccinated and it must have been a pre-existing infection before they had the vaccine. Under those circumstances, the predictive values would be so high that it would be reasonable to do a screen and treat. But as I said, I think it's very much dependent on prevalence and the predictive value and cannot be universally recommended.
Thank you, Professor Dillner. I think everyone agrees that this was an excellent presentation, and especially in this time of COVID, where we're very pessimistic about the future of elimination of cervical cancer. I think you bring hope, and we have to do better. So thank you again, Professor Dillner.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for your attention.